The book Incident at Devil's Den details one of the most disturbing abduction events ever recorded. In fact, it may very well be the most disturbing. If you thought there were just good aliens, think again. Terry Lovelace and his friend Toby experienced terror followed by decades of trauma during an abduction event in Arkansas during 1977. And what followed was inexplicable and continues to haunt Terry to this day. Terry is a former Assistant Attorney General and has been a shining light in a successful legal career, and he recently came forward to tell his story. Welcome, Terry.
Thank you, Dean. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I mentioned the word disturbing. I've heard the story, and I've read the book and listened to your interviews on radio, and it really does send chills up the spine. So, walk us through the abduction event and tell us when it happened and where.
Sure. From 1973 to 1979, I was active duty in the United States Air Force, and a coworker of mine, actually a good friend, suggested that we go to Devil's Den, which was about 6 hours south of where we were stationed at Whiteman Air Force Base in western Missouri. I was an amateur photographer. I had a darkroom set up, and my friend Toby and I we lived on base in NCO housing. And there's not a lot that you can photograph on a strategic air command base. We had, B-52s with nukes and a squadron of Minutemen II ICBMs. So security was tight and photography was frowned upon. I wanted to get away and photograph eagles. So that was kind of the purpose of the exercise. My friend, on the other hand, was an amateur astronomer who just lived to watch the night sky. He could identify the constellations. He was taking physics classes and hoped to go to University of Michigan and major in physics when his enlistment ended. So we made the trip down to Devil's Den, which I didn't know at the time has a long and dark past, a crazy long and dark past. I don't have time to go into here, but we didn't stay in the campground. It was Toby's idea to dodge the park rangers and make this kind of a wilderness adventure. So I call it more like remote camping. We drove deep into the park and we came to, the road degraded from pavement to gravel to dirt to just two ruts in the road. And we came to an area that with a chain across it and a sign kind of intimidating, no admittance. No hiking, camping, fishing, trespassing, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, well, we'll have to turn around and find another route. But my friend Toby said, wait a minute. And he hops out of the car, and the chain across the road was attached to a post. The chain had just been locked on itself to form a loop and draped over the post. So he just picked it up and dropped it to the ground. Mm-hmm. And we were elated. We drove in and tried to stay on an upward climb, on an incline. I have some photographs from Google Earth of the site where we camped on my Facebook page, marked the Incident at Devil's Den page. And I was surprised. I would have expected this area to have been grown with 40-year-old mature trees by now, but it's not. And when you zoom in close, you can see that the grass is cut and there's not a tree on it. It's just this triangular shape landing pad, for lack of a better word. It's on a high plateau, flat as a pool table. And that's where we had the misfortune to set up our camp. It was our first night and everything went pretty well. We did the usual things you do when you camp. You burn some hot dogs and that kind of stuff. But toward the evening, we had a little tent set up, a couple inflatable air mattresses, and some blankets we borrowed from the hospital. And we were both assigned to the hospital squadron as medics, EMTs. Mm-hmm. And we are kicked back on these air mattresses. And I recall saying to Toby, I said, man, this must be the allure of camping. I can see why people like this. It's pleasant. And he said, yeah, man, I told you this would be fun. And we're just kind of chatting. And there came a lull in our conversation, and I noticed that the sounds of the forest, the crickets, the tree frogs, and the forest insects that had been so loud just 15 or 20 minutes earlier were now dead silent. Even the breeze that we had enjoyed earlier had stopped, and it was dead still. And that sounds cliche, I know, but that's what happened. And it was akin to getting in an audio booth and shutting the door. It was that quiet. And it unnerved me. And I asked my friend, Toby, is this normal? I mean, it's awful quiet out here. And he just blew it off and said, yeah, we've been laughing and cutting up. The noises, they'll be back. Don't worry about it. No big deal. But I did fret about it. It was disconcerting to me. And we continued light conversation until my friend turned to the left and said, hey man, were those lights there before? And I'm like, what are you talking about? And he points out on the horizon, there are 3 stars, each one about the same luminosity, same brightness as the North Star. So they were pretty bright. And they formed a tight little triangle that sat just above the horizon. They were too far above the horizon to have been lights from traffic or a train, but they were really too low, and they were stationary, so they couldn't be aircraft. So we were kind of puzzled by them, and we're debating what these things are when they moved. And at first they rotated and they turned like they were on an axis, about a 3/4 turn. And then they started to move up into the sky. And that's when I first felt this feeling of calm wash over me. The uneasiness and the anxiety that I felt earlier when the forest fell quiet was all gone. I felt relaxed. Our reaction to this thing was inappropriate. We should have ran for the car and got out of there.
Do you think you were being manipulated that early?
Absolutely, we were. No question in my mind. We may have even been manipulated to find our way to this spot. In retrospect, I've noted that it was almost as if Toby knew where to go. He chose the location, and as we're driving in, there were many forks in the road. And I gave him credit because he did have an innate, unerring sense of direction. So when he said turn right, I'd turn right. But it seemed like he knew where to go. He took us there. Mm-hmm. And when we arrived, I wanted to camp right in the middle of the campground, but he was insistent. No, we got to camp back by the tree line. And he was so insistent on that, it kind of puzzled me. But the importance of that became apparent a couple hours later. So the lights climbed into the sky. Well, the setting was there were just 1 trillion stars out that night. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. We had 0 light pollution, and we were on elevated ground. So we could see the Milky Way, we could see the constellations. It really was just breathtaking. But as this triangle thing moved up, we could see that it was a solid object. The points of light always remained equidistant to one another. So it wasn't 3 separate objects in unison. Because there was so much starlight, the area inside the triangle was black against the blue sky. And it picked up speed and gained an altitude of, I don't know what, but it gained some altitude, stopped, and then began a descent. And as it descended, it was pretty obvious it was headed in our direction.
Right.
And it did a tumbling and turning kind of movement where it would do somersaults, and there would be 2 points of light, and then the other apex of the triangle would come around to the top and form a triangle again.
Was it noisy?
No, never heard a thing at that time. Never heard a thing. And I remember thinking, that this thing, the thought crossed my mind that this thing was moving with purpose. I don't know why, but that crossed my mind, that it wasn't just tumbling out of control. It had a purpose to its movements. And as it got closer, it got much bigger. And as it descended from the starlight, we could see a triangular shadow move across the forest below us and come in our direction. And the lights on the tips of each point of the triangle dimmed somewhat, but was still bright enough to illuminate the entire forest below us. And this thing stopped about 3,000 feet over our campsite. And it was hard to grasp its size. At 3,000 feet, we could only see the bottom. We couldn't see the entire structure. We would shortly. What happened next was there were a couple of rays of light that shot out from the thing. And I'll just say that there was a white beam of light that was a visible beam of light. It looked like a high power searchlight cutting through fog, but of course there was no fog. It was just this visible beam of white light. That was followed a minute later by a laser-like beam. Lasers were fairly new concept in 1977. I'd seen them on television. I'd never seen one in person. But this laser would land at a spot in the campsite, stay there for a tenth of a second, and then reappear in another location. So it gave the illusion that it was dancing all over our campsite. And I recall thinking, this thing's scanning us,
Mm-hmm.
It's checking us out. It hit me. I never felt anything. I know it hit my friend, the tent, my car. And that lasted for about 3 minutes. And then it was just Toby and I lying there. And I don't think there was a word spoke between us, which was just odd. He,
Were you able to speak?
oh, absolutely. I could speak, but I was sedated is the best word that I could use. Sedated and curiously disinterested. Almost apathetic. And my friend stood up. He startled me when he did, and he said, "Show's over." And he grabbed his air mattress and he threw it into the tent, and I followed suit. As soon as I stood up, I realized all I wanted to do was sleep. It was an effort to make it to the tent. I threw my air mattress in. I didn't bother to undress or take my boots off. I just fell onto the air mattress, and my friend's already snoring softly. And the last thought that I had was, "Toby, you were wrong, because the crickets and the tree frogs never did come back." And I was out. I was unconscious. No dreams, just passage of 4 hours. Of course, I had no idea how much time had passed. And I woke up to flashing yellow and white lights. And when I woke up, I didn't have my wits about me, if that makes sense. I was confused, and I thought for a moment, oh yeah, Toby and I are camping. That's where we're at. And these lights, they must be the overhead lights of a camper, a ranger's truck. The park rangers come to kick us out of the park. And I heard this. That's the first time I heard the noise. I heard a low droning noise that I describe as more powerful than loud. And it was kind of akin to if you ever stood next to a locomotive or a large piece of industrial machinery. There's that vibration from the machinery that reverberates in your chest. And that's the noise I heard. And inside the tent, it is absolutely pitch black, except for when these lights would light up the inside of the tent. And they were as brilliant as an old school flash bulb from the 60s, that,
Yep.
and with one of these flashes of light, I saw my friend on his knees peering outside the tent, looking at something. And Toby was African American, and he had tear tracks down his face that when the light hit, I guess the salt water and the tears against the skin contrasted, and I could clearly see he was crying. He wasn't sobbing, but he was crying. There were tears rolling down his face. And I was confused and I was scared. And that's the moment when I realized that we were in some kind of trouble. And all of the feeling of sedation and disinterest and apathy that I felt earlier vanished. And in an instant, I was scared to death. And I got to my knees and I realized that I was hurt. I was in a lot of pain. And I nudged Toby to the left and I pulled back a flap of the tent to see what he's looking at. And I saw what I first took to be children, maybe a dozen or 15. And they're paired up in twos and threes. And they're just wandering around this, I call it a meadow at the time. And it struck me as so odd. And I said, Toby, man, what are these kids doing out here in the middle of the night? And he said, Terry, man, those ain't no little kids. They took us and they hurt us. They're not human, Terry. They're not human beings, Terry. Look at them.
Wow.
And I did look at them, and he was right. They were not human beings. Their heads were disproportionately large to their bodies. Their torsos were just very, very thin. Their upper limbs were longer than they should have been. And they walked with a very distinctive gait. They walked like they had sore feet, all of them. I don't know what that's from, but that's the way they walked. And that frightened me a lot. While we're watching these little guys, a light turned on from underneath the ship. And it was, again, that same quality of white light, visible light that I experienced earlier. And it was in a column about 30 feet in diameter. Now, I should mention, when we went to bed, this thing was about 3,000 feet over our head. Now, this thing had descended and is 30 feet over our heads. And now we can see the full size of it. And I estimated it to be a city block in length on each leg of the triangle. And it was deep. It was 5 stories deep. It was as if someone levitated a medical building 30 feet over the ground. And while we're watching it, these little guys in groups of 2s and 3s would wander into this column of white light and just dissolve into it and vanish. And we watched until the last 2 walked into the light and vanished. And as soon as they did, the light cut out and the droning noise stopped. The lights that were coming from what I call a light bar, there was a bar that ran from the bottom of the triangle to the very top. That changed in colors from yellowish, greenish, and white to just pure white. And I remember thinking, that light runs up and down that light bar, and that's what gives the illusion of a twinkling star when you see it in the sky. And we're just watching, we're terrified, and we saw the thing lift off. And it didn't lift off like a rocket, it just rose up like a hot air balloon. Slowly at first, and then the higher it got, the faster it went. And we watched it until it was 3 dots in the sky and then 1 point of light and then gone.
So you say you were in pain. I mean, do you remember what actually happened to you during that missing time?
I have bits and pieces. I do not have a clear linear memory of what happened, but I do have recollection of being inside that thing. As far as our injuries, we were burned. I was burned to a crisp. It was like the worst sunburn you could possibly imagine, short of blistering. I never blistered, but I was burned on the soles of my feet, under my arms. I mean, literally every inch of my body. And I felt like I had sand in my eyes. I found out later at the hospital I had what's characterized as arc welder's burn or flash burn. It's what an arc welder would receive if he didn't protect his eyes during welding. And that's a very painful thing.
Mm-hmm.
We were afraid to move out of the tent. The tent gave us cover, at least. I felt like if I walked out of the tent or even ran out of the tent, that I'd be vulnerable. I didn't want to be exposed. At least I was hidden underneath that thin layer of canvas. But Toby was right. He said, man, we got to get out of here. He says, I think they're all gone. Let's just get out of here. So with a little encouragement from him, that's what we did. We bolted and ran to my car, and we got in and we drove back to the base. When we got back to the base, our wives took us both to the hospital. And we were admitted to the hospital. I didn't know it at the time, but we were classified as acutely ill due to dehydration. I remember on the drive back being so thirsty. Never in my life had I been so thirsty. And I just could not get enough to drink. My friend Toby was hurt much worse than I was. And he was kind of curled into a fetal position in the front seat of my 66 Chevy that had the large bench seats.
Mm-hmm.
And he was hurting. He really was. And he was in no condition to drive a car. So the doctor came in and said, and we both worked at the hospital squadron, so we knew everyone there. It was like family. And a doctor that I knew came in and said, what happened to you guys? Now, I knew that if I told him, and even if Toby backed up my story, if we told him we saw a UFO the size of a medical building, they would have sent us for a psych evaluation. That would have happened, no question in my mind. So we opted to just cut out that part.
Right.
We went camping, we went to bed, we woke up sick as dogs. And that was our story.